the 29 task forces of 1991 to find out what value addition has been coming in 2024, 2025 now, in terms of issues which were raised at that time. সমস্যা যে হচ্ছে এখানে that year after year we go on having the same discussion. The whole issue of export diversification was being addressed by Razak and Salim when they began their careers at CPD, and they were working on the independent review of Bangladesh's development in the early reports that they were preparing. So they were discussing precisely these issues, and I would suspect if you revisit that, many of the suggestions that you were making in those days. Now you have been able to do much more research, you have much more experience, you have been able to explore what you did then, but you can do it at much greater depth, and you can give much more amplified answers. But what you have not been able to answer over these 30 years is why issues which were being identified as options and were then being continuously discussed and amplified by in-depth research are still on the table today. So why something has not happened, unless you can properly diagnose that, you are not really going to make meaningful policy reform suggestions for the future. So this is the big unaddressed issue, both at the level of academic research and also in terms of official policy making. And I would certainly suggest, in fact, I would have hoped that the task force that you have set up could have addressed some of these issues. Now, for example, problems being faced by the leather industry, problems related to diversification and backward linkage of the RMG. Not only have these issues been discussed in general, special task forces and in-depth studies specifically targeted to these issues have been set up. I don't know how many special task forces just to look at the problems of diversification and promoting exports from the leather industry have been set up. If you have done some homework, you should really look into that. Now, no one is again suggesting that highly promising industry like leather should not have in fact come forward and developed over there. If you look at countries like China, China has basically begun its industrialization process by taking cognizance of the fact that it had a billion population market. And the main initial attraction of FDI coming into China was to access the Chinese market. This was, in fact, if you look at a whole bunch of the automobile manufacturers who all came to China and made China the biggest manufacturer of automobiles, overtaking the US, it was the domestic market for China which was the main attraction. It is only now that China, particularly with regard to electronic vehicles, is now emerged as one of the world's largest exporters. So correspondingly, Bangladesh's domestic market should not be ignored. After all, if you have 175 million people and this domestic market is growing at 6% every year, it is obviously a very attractive market. And quite a number of FDI people who have come in have also come in to target that market. So whether this market has been adequately exploited, whether quality improvements can be made in this particular market, and whether a whole range of products which have matured in the domestic market and can then be diverted into export, for example, like bicycles, like domestic electronic products which are coming from Walton and products of that nature. There are a whole range of industries which have acquired maturity and are graduating into exports. Now, a whole bunch of industries which have come up and modernized, like the leather industry, actually the biggest investors were all initially export oriented. In fact, they started targeting the domestic market at a much later stage. I mean, Apex retail outlets, which I'm seeing all over the place now, for the first 10 to 15 years, they did not exist because Apex was exporting all its products in that particular period of time. So to have an exclusive discussion on promoting exports and to overlook a domestic market in the way in which that domestic market is evolving and how you want to deal with it is also no less an issue. For example, if you look at the steel industry, in pre-liberation period, we only had one public sector steel mill, the Chittagong Steel Mill, producing 100,000 tons of very basic steel items. Now, any one of the big mills like BSRM will be producing 1 million tons of steel, and they will be producing a much more diversified and sophisticated range of products. So this itself is a relevant issue. The whole discussion now, which you have taken up, I'm glad to say, in your task force report on MS medium and small range, how you can actually upgrade their products and link them to the modern export sector and the modern advanced sectors of the economy and create value chains going right back so that you can add productivity and quality to those products. Those again are major areas of investment which we need to make. Now, let me just round this up. I don't want, because I have a problem that having participated in this discussion 1,000 times in the last 30 years, I don't really find I have much value addition to make in anything I have to say over here. One new thing I think you have to take into account, I mean, you mentioned it, but I don't think you adequately took cognizance of it. The world in which you grew up and you learned your economics and you advanced it, of liberalization and globalization, that world is now in retreat. And what you are now witnessing is not so much the high tariffs of Trump, but the actual weaponization of tariffs. So that now tariffs and a whole variety of other economic and trade sanctions are being used as political instruments by particular countries, but particularly the powerful ones. First the US, then European Union is slowly entering into that market. India is following Europe. India is following the United States. China has its own range of policies. All are essentially recognizing that the whole world of rule-based trade, on which theoretically the WTO was based, it was never really a rule-based system. It was just part of the fantasy created by the Western countries that it was such. But whatever it is now, I mean, some rules still prevail over there. This world is now changing. So how does a country like Bangladesh adjust to this? I mean, we are sitting around with our tongues hanging out that because tariffs are going to be raised on Chinese exports, then we will automatically be able to go in and fill that vacuum. But I don't really think that's how the game is going to be played out. What is essentially happening now in the politicization of the trading regime in the world is that bilateral relationships are going to prevail between the big countries and their trading partners, and that you will have to enter into individual bilateral trading relationships with a whole range of countries, from the EU to the United States to China to India. And that is in fact going to really determine the trading regime of a country such as Bangladesh. And you will also have to deal with the very erratic nature of a politicized system. Because tomorrow, Trump may be putting a 30% tariff on China. But if he makes some political deal somewhere else, he may bring it down to 10%. So that you have taken advantage of a 30% access, you are now competing on different terms day after tomorrow. So that is also an issue which you actually have to address over here. Lastly, I would say that we all talk about FDI for a very long time, and we have not really been able to attract FDI. Now, what in the research on that we have not adequately done is to perhaps sit down and have intensive conversations with the FDI investors who are already in Bangladesh, and to ask them then what are the concerns and constraints within which they are actually operating, and then to use that information input to then revisit our strategy in terms of how we are attracting FDI. In fact, the fact that we should have one of the lowest rates of FDI inflow into the country, when we were actually one of the better performing countries in the region, this, of course, is an issue we need to look at much more carefully. I mean, why should we be having lower rates of FDI coming in here than it going into a crisis-ridden country like Pakistan? That, again, is a not very satisfactory answer. So, with these words, what I would also hope is that focus your remainder of your discussions in the next 2 days now, not on revisiting old debates. You have put a certain set of concrete recommendations on the table, whether you call them low-hanging or high-hanging, I'm not quite, it doesn't really matter. The relevant issue is pick up a whole range of specific recommendations you've made, and then focus the conversation on those particular recommendations if you want to really get serviceable inputs from your audience. I mean, this morning, a lot of the discussion was participating in debates with Razak and Salim, which we have had many times, and he's simply re-engaging himself in those debates, so I don't really think there is much use in actually doing that. So do that, and the other thing I would suggest that you focus on over here over the next 2 days is then where you have actually made recommendations about what reforms can be carried out. Don't just look at that reform process for its intellectual content. Look at it also in terms of its operationability. That in the event that this government is supposed to initiate a particular reform, what exactly would it actually have to do over there? Suppose you are wanting to say that you want to create some of the opportunities available to the RMG sector for other export-oriented sectors. You've got 10 propositions over there. Now, can Mr. Bashiruddin, in fact, it would be interesting to ask him these questions, initiate in the course of the next 6 months any of those actions? And were he to initiate it, would the Ministry of Commerce and its related bodies, not to mention the NBR, be able to actually operationalize and activate these? So try and keep the discussion focused on what you want from this audience. And then the next question you will want to ask them is, how will you get about it? In which of this can you do tomorrow or the after? In which have most that I can see when I've looked at all your recommendations will really be an will really be a election manifesto for a prospective government participating in the next election. It have very little possibility for any of this to really move forward. But if it can be done, then identify that and discuss that aspect of it. Thank you.